My name's Lindsay Thurman, and I have been living with PAH since 2008. When I was first diagnosed, I was having a lot of trouble breathing. I almost passed out a couple times, and I actually ended up getting a diagnosis and then being told that I was fine because of a mix-up at my doctor's office, and went without treatment for about 3 years, which of course made my disease progress a lot, so that I actually did start passing out. Went back, and they basically were like, oops, sorry, and started me on treatment. And then from 2012 to about 2020, there was just kind of this flow with things where I would get sicker and then go back to the doctor. You know, we'd usually add another treatment because our goal's been trying to keep oral treatments as long as possible. So I would respond to it for a while, and then slowly the pressure in my lungs would creep back up, and we'd add another oral medication until we were up to 3. And what ended up happening was in February of 2020, things had gotten really bad. Probably the worst they've been for me, definitely since my diagnosis or since I started treatment. I knew my disease was getting worse because I went into arrhythmia during my 6-minute walk test, which I usually would do very good on. I always walked pretty fast on those. And they freaked out and sent me to the hospital. I was convinced that they sent me there because they were going to start me on IV meds, which I later found out was one of the reasons why they sent me. They were worried they would have to start me on IV meds. But thankfully, the right heart cath was showing that the pressures were in the 50s as opposed to the 90s, which is what my echo was showing. Because of that, my doctor felt comfortable swapping out one of the medications I was on for another one in the same pathway. So originally I had started on Adcirca and then years later added Opsumit. Then I added Uptravi. And so at this point we were swapping out Adcirca for Adempas. I didn't have very high hopes. In my experience, my treatments would work for a little while and then everything would get worse again. And at the time felt like the beginning of the end. And it definitely felt like I was on the verge of needing IV meds. But I started taking Adempas and it was very strange for me. The first night I took it, I went out to dinner with a friend, and I remember saying that it felt really strange because it felt like there was too much room in my lungs, which sounds weird probably to a normal person. But, you know, it was like, oh, I don't have to try to breathe. It's just happening. And I could breathe in deeper if I wanted to. And I didn't really like it because I wasn't used to it. It totally freaked me out. But then I got used to it. It was great. So ever since my diagnosis, I had always done my best to be as in shape as I could, given the constraints, because I could never run. So what I would do is I would walk. And I would walk 5 to 10 miles several times a week in a local park here in Kentucky that has pretty big hills. I wouldn't always go very fast. And there were a lot of times when I would have to stop and catch my breath. But I would try and make goals for myself as far as like how far I would go or trying to walk faster, things like that. And then I always did yoga and stuff. After starting Adempas, it was springtime, like in April, I was getting back to walking. I was really excited because before in 2020, I was having a really hard time with hills. And now all of a sudden I realized that I wasn't even getting slightly out of breath on hills, which never happened, even with all the years of walking on these hills. So I was at the park with my dogs and I just kind of got this inkling in my head, you know, what if I could run? Now, I wonder, because I've been breathing so well, and since I started Adempas, I hadn't had any sort of symptoms. This was during the pandemic, so I teach high school. So thankfully, I was able to work from home, and my days weren't too bad because I would do video calls and then have the kids do assignments. I had a lot of ability to get outside pretty regularly. So when I got home from the park, I decided I was going to try to run just around the block. But at the end of the street, there was a group of people. And they were just standing there talking. And I had tried to run in the past. And every time I did, I just couldn't do it. I would take like 2 steps. My lungs would just basically shut it down. I would not barely be able to breathe. So I had to stop. And I didn't want to embarrass myself by running 2 steps and then having to stop in front of like a crowd. So I just kind of walked past them. And once I was past them, I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And I started jogging very, very slowly, but it was weird because I didn't have to stop. And it took me a while to even figure out what was going on because I was concentrating so hard on breathing and like listening to my body because I didn't want to do anything that would hurt me or put me in a position where I might like pass out or something. So I was so intently focused on my breathing that after a while, I realized I was all the way down at the end of the block and turning because I live at the end of a cul-de-sac. So I was kind of going like around the cul-de-sac. I just remember thinking, wait, am I breathing? Is this normal breathing? And it was, and I made it all the way back to my house, which ended up being half a mile. And I just about like freaked out. I started calling everybody that I knew to be like, you're never going to guess what happened. All of them were very cautiously optimistic and said, that's great, but don't go crazy. Don't push yourself. But all I wanted to do was do it again. So from there, the next day, I made myself wait till the next day to try again. And then the next day, I was like, I'm going to do a mile. But instead of stopping, I ended up doing like 2.5 miles or something. And very shortly after that, that was up to like a 5K and then 5 miles, 6 miles, 8 miles. I just kept building distance on. And I had this goal that I wanted to do the Triple Crown, which is a series of races in Louisville where they do a 5K, a 10K, and a 15K. So I was like, man, if I could do a 15K, that would be amazing. And so I went out for a run at this one park that spans pretty much across the entire city. So you can go as far as you want, come back. And I ended up doing 11 miles. And I thought to myself, that's pretty close to a half marathon. It didn't even really feel that difficult because I always kept my pace pretty slow. I let my lungs kind of guide how fast I was running. I never pushed myself for speed. And I think because of all of the walking I'd been doing for over a decade really helped me be able to just build on distance once I started running because my body was used to like long continuous movement. I'd called my doctor and asked about the running, and he said that he thought it was great as long as I felt good the entire time. And before my appointment, I weirdly got the idea that if I could do a half marathon, maybe I could do a full marathon. But I wanted my doctor to sign off on that. So I went back to the park. I did 16.2 miles. Yeah. See, because then I was within 10 of a marathon. This is just a few months later. I went to my doctor, showed him my run on my tracking app on my phone and was like, what do you think about me doing a marathon? And the nurse practitioner in his office was all about it. She was like, oh, that's awesome. And he said, I think it would be better to stick to shorter distances, which wasn't technically a no. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. So I just decided that I knew my body. I could tell if I was doing something dangerous. So I was going to try to train for a marathon and see what happened and maybe just tell him about it afterwards. You should always get your doctor's approval for things, but he was encouraging me to run. He just didn't think a marathon was a great idea. I did compete in the Triple Crown, which was fun, but at that point I'd run so much further than a 15K. It didn't really seem that exciting. And then I did the mini marathon, which is a half marathon here that's part of the Kentucky Derby Festival. And that was something I had dreamed about doing since I was a kid because my mom used to run it. I always thought it was so cool. There's people cheering you along the entire way. It just looked so fun to me when I was little. But that became an impossible dream when I got diagnosed with PAH. So that was a really cool moment to get to do that, to live that out. The mini marathon was almost exactly 1 year after my first run. And then the marathon was the following November. So November of 2021. There was all sorts of drama. I injured my heel just from running so much and bugged my rheumatologist incessantly by trying to get him to give me something to make it stop hurting, even though he was continuously telling me that the only thing that would help it was rest and ice. But I didn't want to rest, which made training more difficult. I even learned about something called aqua jogging, where you put on a flotation belt and you are upright in the deep end of a pool with just your head above water, and you kind of pretend run underwater and you move really slow because you're not swimming, you're running. But it's a way to mimic running without putting any stress on your joints. I would do it for hours at a time, which would be embarrassing because there would be kids doing swim practice and they'd look at this like head floating down the pool back and forth, just moving super slow. So that was strange. But the day of the marathon finally came and was very nervous. I had a goal of 5.5 hours because I could do a half marathon in 2.5 hours. So I was like, I'll give myself an extra half hour to like walk some. And it started off super great. I was having a great time. People always talk about a wall. And I'd never experienced that, even though I'd done a 20-mile run and I'd done a 22-mile run. When I was in the marathon, I got to about mile 18 and I kind of paused to walk to eat a granola bar. And I started thinking, okay, how many more miles do I have left? And I was like, oh, wow, I have like 8 miles left. And then I started thinking about how long it took me to run 8 miles. And all of a sudden I was like, oh man, that's a long time. I want to be done. I don't want to do this anymore. And at that point, it became very difficult to will myself to run. I would take a lot of walking breaks. And I'd set myself up with plenty of time to spare to hit my goal of 5.5 hours. But by the end, there was a lot of walk, jog, walk, jog. I kept trying to tell myself in my brain that if it's 5:35, that's not that big of a deal. That's close enough. But I am also incredibly stubborn. And I knew that I was going to be very angry at myself if I didn't hit that goal because I knew I was capable of it. And thankfully, I finished in like 5:27 because if I hadn't, I might have done something crazy like sign up for another one. Once you cross the finish line, all of the pain and all of the stress, just completely melts away. It was such a cool moment because it really felt like I had just done the impossible. Running was supposed to be impossible, period. And being able to do a marathon was just totally impossible. It was really cool thinking back. It was 19 months from being in the hospital bed in February, thinking, oh, well, this is the downhill part of my life. It's just going to keep getting progressively worse until I die. And then 19 months later, I ran a full marathon. Like just reflecting on that was just kind of insane. Well, definitely one of the best days of my life. Not so much the end part, those last 8 miles. That part was not great, but the part after the finish line, that part was wonderful. And, obviously I celebrated with my family and had a great time. And since then I've, continued running. What I find really interesting with something like PAH, with it being so rare, I've been very excited about the advancements they've made in treatment options. Because I looked it up one time. The 3 medications I'm on right now, which are Opsumit, Uptravi, and Adempas, none of those existed when I was first diagnosed. I think Opsumit might have been in the study phase because I entered in at the very end of that study in 2010. But Uptravi, I don't think got approved till 2012. Adempas is, I think, still considered relatively new. So it's just crazy to me to see even just how much progress has been made in the amount of time since I've had it, which gives me hope because if these medications become less effective, I know that there's still options out there that could hopefully keep me. I want to stay where I am now because it's really cool to not have any symptoms, especially having had horrible symptoms for years. There's a learning curve when it comes to figuring out how to exercise safely because the most important thing is to not exacerbate your pulmonary hypertension. It sounds cliche, but it's all about listening to your body. The way I think of it really is I always let my lungs guide me. And it's not that you can't get out of breath. It's that there's a safe version of out of breath and there's a non-safe version of out of breath. And you have to be able to distinguish between the two. For me, it feels like a pressure in my chest if it's the bad kind. If I get out of breath and can feel like pressure building in my lungs or in my heart or wherever it's happening, that's when I immediately stop. And generally I'll close my eyes and try and calm my breathing and calm my heart rate as best I can. The times when I pass out is when I'm unsuccessful in that endeavor. So it's important to recognize what good out of breath feels like. It's so hard to explain without someone being able to feel what I feel when it's happening. But it's almost like my body has alarm bells. When I'm out of breath and it's safe, I never get super out of breath. It's just maybe I'm breathing a little bit harder and there's no tension. There's no pressure. It's just I happen to be breathing a little bit quicker. It's also incredibly important to slowly build on things. When I ran, I was building my distance relatively quickly. But that was because I was familiar with long distances and walking. And I had had a lot of experience listening to my body. So everything I was doing felt completely safe the entire time. But you can't just go from, 0 to 5 miles all of a sudden. It's hard because there's nothing you can do as far as working out to improve your ability to breathe, which a lot of people who don't have pulmonary hypertension don't understand. When I've talked to other people who work, like normal people who work out, they always talk about like how important it is, like push yourself cardiovascularly, and that's how you get better and that's how you get stronger. And for me, it has to be completely the opposite. If I push myself cardiovascularly, I run the risk of going into arrhythmia, passing out, or even possibly dying from right heart failure. The way you can push yourself really is more to increase distance on a walk or doing things that aren't really considered cardiovascular. Like for me, it's yoga. Some people, I don't do much weightlifting, so I don't know what that's like, but maybe weightlifting or some kind of anaerobic exercise. Because I have a lot of experience with yoga, I recommend it so much to just anybody because it's so good for blood flow, or like all your circulation. It helps with breathing. It helps with meditation techniques, which can just be good when you are living with pulmonary hypertension, because it's a stressful disease. Nobody likes specialty pharmacies or having to call them every month. Nobody likes having to set a million reminders in your phone for medications and, all that stuff. It's just, everything about it is frustrating. So for me, yoga's always been really great. But the best thing about it is that you can start from anywhere. And every single pose can be modified. Once you get really good at certain things, you can start doing more challenging poses. There's always room to grow, and you can start literally anywhere. So I definitely recommend that. But I also would definitely recommend walking, just because that kept me so healthy for so long in spite of being sick. I used to call myself a healthy sick person. Now I feel more like just a healthy person thanks to my medication. But being a healthy sick person is definitely a good goal to have. My name is Lindsay Thurman, and I'm aware that I'm rare.